Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Rupita Bhattacharjee and you're watching my channel named after me because I like creativity. So I've been gone for a while, 3 weeks to be exact, and that was because I was feeling lazy and did not want to make a video with and also one of my previous videos hit 1.2k views and it's one of my first videos to even cross 100 views. So thank you for that. And if you haven't already watched it, the link is in the description. Make sure to go check it out. With that out of the way, let's divulge into today's discussion. So what I wanted to talk about was the worst books that I read in this year, 2021. Starting with The Maidens by Alex Michalowicz. The premise of The Maidens is Mariana, a therapist in London whose husband died recently, is informed by her niece, who she is the guardian of, that her niece's best friend was recently murdered in a brutal way at Cambridge University. Upon reaching the university, Mariana is pretty sure that Edward Fosca, a charismatic American professor teaching Greek tragedies at the university, is the man behind this murder. And somehow, this young group of female students who are completely obsessed with Edward, the professor, who have a secret society of their own, must be connected to the murder. The secret society of these young girls, the Maidens. Now, this book was supposed to be dark academia set at a university with considerable themes of Greek tragedy and all of that stuff tied in. But what I felt was a completely lackluster thriller with a plot twist that throws the whole book off. Firstly, the writing style of this book was the only saving grace of it. I really liked Alex Michalowicz's use of purple prose, the way he wrote out our main character Mariana to be a sympathetic, a relatable character, someone you'd feel pity for, someone you would root for. But we'll have to consider that Mariana, as the main character, makes a considerable string of stupid decisions. Not only is she overtly trusting while investigating a murder, but also pokes her nose in areas where it doesn't belong. And upon reprimanded for doing so, she believes herself to be the right person. During the investigation, Mariana goes around accusing random people she doesn't have any proof against, and when the cops don't believe her, we, the reader, are supposed to believe that Mariana is in the right and the cop who is doing his job is in the wrong. In the whole book, Mariana does things that are completely illegal, that is messing with an official investigation, conducting one of her own when she does not have a license, and other things that should be considered illegal but are not, but only stupid people do those. One thing that I had the main thing that ruined this entire book was the plot twist at the end. Through the entirety of this novel, the writer spends a considerable amount of time, the author, writing up other people to be the villain. There are red herrings and foreshadowing that would actually make sense if someone else was the villain instead of the murderer being completely catching the reader completely off guard. See, a good plot twist should be something that the reader can predict, that the reader can go back and trace out and see, how did I miss this? But what The Maidens is a way to end this book without actually using your logical skills. Out of nowhere, we have the murderer, someone who doesn't even make sense for that particular person to be the murderer, because the entire range of clues that the author has been leaving in the entire book point towards someone else. But at the end, we have this plot twist that just feels like a subpar attempt at ending the novel. A way to rush things up because the author got tired of writing it. I think this book would be immensely better if the author had actually utilized all the foreshadowing they had done, utilized everything that they had done through the entirety of this novel, and actually gave a satisfying conclusion instead of the very rushed thing that we got. I usually think that this happens when someone is writing some sort of thriller novel where the author just gets tired of writing this and rushes the ending, and that was the same case with this book. One thing that I felt was this was some attempt at expanding the author's universe from his previous book, that was The Silent Patient. Some characters from The Silent Patient reappear in this book, and it just feels like writing a separate book so you can write more about the characters from the first book. Overall, this book was just a 1 star for me, and the 1 star is there because of Alice Miguelet's wonderful writing style. This book was also supposed to be dark academia, but it's just people reading out random pieces of literature or poetry, and they don't actually have any consequences or any relevancy in the book. We'll move on to the next book that I absolutely disliked, and it was Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Now, I am in the minority for this one. This book was absolutely loved by a lot of my friends, a lot of people I know, and a lot of reviewers on Goodreads. It's considered to be one of the best books that people have ever read. But for me, it was not very good. I can see the hype and why people will definitely love this one, but I found the lacking of a plot in this. There's literally no plot. So the premise starts with two magicians who are in a battle of wit and power through the entirety of their lives, and this battle will only end when one magician is eliminated. And the arena for this battle is the Night Circus, a circus where everything comes true, a circus that moves from one place to another and nobody knows where it came from or where it's going next. This was a more setting inspired book than it was a book with actual plot in it. The book has lengthy descriptions of the setting of the Night Circus itself, of even the grass, the sky, and what color the fabric is, but I cannot name a defining trait of a single character in this entire book. It's a very plot-driven book and not a character-driven book. Though I do not have a preference in that matter, I prefer any book plot-driven or character-driven as long as it actually has some engagement. I had a lot of trouble engaging with the characters. They were one-dimensional, did not have any flaws. How do I talk about flaws and they did not have any character traits? They were very 2D and not well developed at all. There was no apparent character development from the beginning of this book to the ending of this book. There was no chemistry between the leading characters, and overall it was just not satisfactory. I did not enjoy this book also because it was unbearably slow. The pacing of this book was almost non-existent since some parts were repeated over and over again. There were also time jumps involved when one chapter was set in the past, another chapter was set 10 years in the future, making it confusing for the reader to know where the story was heading or where the story was at the present moment. Overall, if you're an enjoyer of pulpit prose, which I am too, but not to this extent, just want to read a book that you can get lost in and something that has a lot of imagery involved, the Night Circus would be perfect for you. But if you are one like me, you want world building, you want character development, you want engaging characters, the Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern is definitely a book you should skip. My dogs are barking so much, so do not mind the poor audio quality. Next, let us talk about another book that I hated so much, and it's actually a sequel, Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare. Now, Cassandra Clare is no surprising that she's on this list because I think that the amount of books that she has written and over the amount of decades she has spent in the writing industry, the quality of her writing has deteriorated a lot. One thing that I noticed was the practical reusing of her previous plots, reusing of her character arcs over and over again. And as someone who has technically read all of her books, I mean, except for a few, I have mostly read all of the books she wrote. She was actually the first author I ever read in the fantasy genre. I absolutely used to love her works because they were quite engaging and quite fun to read. They were fast-paced and good, and a quick introduction to the fantasy genre, the Shadowhunter Chronicles. But Chain of Iron for me was disappointing to say the least. So the Chain of Iron, I cannot give you a lot of this one's premise without spoiling the first book, that was Chain of Gold. So the Chain of Iron starts off where the first book ended, but in this one there's a murder haunting the streets of London. picking out shadow hunters, the main characters of our novel, and killing them. So our main character, James, he thinks that somehow he is tied into this killing, that he might be a murderer in some way. But others disagree and no one has any proof or any clues to who the real murderer might even be. So that was the premise. It was certainly interesting, but it was interesting. It was different than what other Shadowhunter novels have put out. I thought Chain of Iron would be more thrill based than it would be action based, but I was severely disappointed. There were only a few moments in the book where I actually liked the characters, and only a few moments where I felt, yeah, the plot is finally moving. But other than that, this book was a stagnant time waste. So first thing that I hated was a miscommunication trope. The miscommunication is useful in certain times when two people actually cannot talk or cannot communicate because of issues. But in this one, if you just lock the characters in a room and allow them to just talk, everything will be solved. If miscommunication or the actual conflict in your book can be solved that easily, maybe it's time for you to find something more. The villains, Cassandra Clare has a big problem with villains. Of all the books I've read from her, she cannot write a villain at all. Some of her villains are downright annoying and minor villains. Some of her villains do not have a clear motive. Some of her villains do not even have a personality. And from what I have noticed, Chain of Iron's villain is some weird caricature of villains from the previous books that she has written. Firstly, the villain is defeated quite easily by a main character, has no roles other than annoying the main character and being not a source of conflict. The villain does not create any disturbance in the plot. The villain has no significance or relevancy in the plot of this book, which is pretty annoying to me because I love to read villains, well-written villains, villains with a good motive, villains who actually strike fear into the reader, and not villains who are just the on steroid version of your 5th grade history teacher who was a cranky old woman. That was oddly specific. Now, another thing that I hated about this book was character arcs being reused over and over again. A lot of characters in this book are from Cassandra Clare's previous series, the Clockwork Angel, the Infernal Devices series. And one thing is to be noticed that most of her characters in the Chain of Iron book have the exact same character arc of the characters from the Infernal Devices series, which was pretty boring to read because I can pinpoint where these stories are leading to be. There are also major plot holes which Cassandra Clare has been trying to hide by saying there's a mistake in the book universe and not on her side, something that will lead to another major event. I just think that the Shadowhunter series do not need any more books. I mean, we could have just stopped with this series when Infernal Devices ended. We could have just left it there. I mean, let it die. There's literally no more content to be milked out of the Shadowhunter Chronicles. I mean, from someone who has read mostly all of Cassandra Clare's novels, I don't think I'll be reading her Wicked Powers trilogy, which will be coming out in 2025 to 27 in that timeline. It is utterly boring for me to continue anymore because there's characters who are no longer engaging, character arcs that have ended and they have no more relevancy, and the lack of villain or major conflict that isn't miscommunication. That was a rant. So we'll move on to the next book and the last book on here, Malice by Heather Walters, which is also a 2021 new release. Now, Malice by Heather Walters is a retelling of The Sleeping Beauty, and for a retelling, I thought it did an exemplary job of putting its own twists on the fairy tale, of creating characters that were quite different from the original fairy tale, and overall a satisfactory conclusion and a good take on what the original fairy tale entailed. So this book is told from the point of view of Alice, who is a dark fae, fae as in fairy. I still do not understand the concept of fae. So Alice has been mistreated her entire life by the people of her kingdom. She has been shunned and bullied by her peers, and she works as a fae for the kingdom now. People can ask her for favors if they want someone else to grow acne or something like that. She works to make other people ugly on getting money from the people who want her to do the job. She does others' dirty works, but in the way of magic. What I hated about this one was the lack of world building. Honestly, this one is pretty basic. The world building had the capacity of becoming high fantasy, but the author definitely forced it down to low fantasy. And a lot of concepts in this book, like the Fae, the war, and everything that had taken place, was underexplained, not brushed upon, and just swept under the rug for future purposes. There was some considerate amount of information withholding that annoyed me. And another thing was that this book was downright predictable. It was so predictable that I have seen this kind of thing before. This sort of plot twist had been used in a lot of fantasy books before, and I was hoping to see something new. But I did not mind the predictability of the book. What I minded was how unbearably slow it was and how the pacing was off. At first, the book started out slow, then the pacing started speeding off, and I thought maybe we'll hit a major plot point next, but we didn't. The pacing was for nothing and a mistake on the author's part, and the book started slowing down again to such a point where I considered not finishing it and just shelving it back. Another thing that I hated was there's a corruption arc in this book, but the corruption arc is totally undeserved. Our main character does not actually go through something to make the corruption arc justiciable. It just feels out of the place, and for the necessity of the second book the corruption arc takes place. I think that was a spoiler. I'll just mark it as spoilers. I thought the writing style of this book was pretty basic and not for fantasy. It could be a YA book when it is not YA. The prose was non-existent. There was this lack of purple prose or flowery language that I usually seek out in books. And overall, I did not just like it. It was boring, not fun to read, and basically, I do not have any words to describe the kind of disaster that Malice was. Even though I am looking forward to reading the second book, Misrule, because as I mentioned in my previous video, duologies do have this recurring problem where the first book is not up to mark, but the second book steps up the game and is a good one. So let's hope that Misrule, which is book 2 of the Malice duology, does not disappoint me. So that was it for today. I talked about 4 books that were some of my worst reads of 2021. I actually did have more books that I wanted to talk about, but I do not have more time to shoot, so I guess that's it. Make sure to like, share and subscribe if you like this video. Leave a comment down below and hit the bell icon because I'll be making more videos. Some of them would be best books of 2021. Some of them would be books I did not read this year and books that I am excited to read next year. That was it for today. I hope you liked it. Be safe during this pandemic. Goodbye and thank you for watching.